Converting stored energy. Converting stored energy.
Sorry, photographers, but we only have 30 minutes, so take one shot, not 12. Oh, whoa, autographs later, sorry. Les photographes, please, photographers, please, dégagez. Et pendant que vous dégagez, soyez assez gentils. Lorsque vous avez une question à poser, levez-vous, faites un signe un petit peu à l'avance, levez-vous, posez votre question, présentez-vous, rendez le micro et rasseyez-vous. D'avance, merci. Come on, guys. No, later. Bien, bonjour à tous, hello everyone, et bienvenue à la conférence de presse pour Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Je vais très vite vous présenter les personnes qui sont ici à ce podium. Doll's House, with a real life character.
But there was actually something funny because the clip that we show in the movie Operazione Dano.
Okay then.
Today's guest is Rebecca Traister.
And I'm saying this not as some angry white women, angry about the alterations to a patriarchal power structure that had been made by those feminists during the second wave. She led an army of women who were angry about those changed rules and expectations and opportunities in an incredibly successful, incredibly canny, tactically brilliant move against the ratification of the ERA. And she won in 1982. And in doing so, she and that army are the ones who dealt that second wave feminism its kind of symbolic final blow. And she did that while angry, but also her book was The Power of the Positive Woman. And if you listen to people who worked with Phyllis Schlafly, she said we always had to smile. We were doing this with smiles on our faces, again, kind of reaffirming. And she herself, as a woman who was constantly out on the road, was also affirming the values of traditional stay-at-home maternity, right? This was the figure that she embodied. And if you're embodying that figure of the woman who is valued on traditional patriarchal scales, and your anger is on behalf of those traditional patriarchal powers, then that anger is not going to be viewed or treated as the same kind of threat to that power as if you're Flo Kennedy or Fannie Lou Hamer or Bella Abzug or Hillary Clinton.
All right, so you mentioned a Clinton. I want to talk about both Clintons because I think so much of the current moment can be interpreted in light of their influence. But let's start with Bill Clinton, because it seems to me that he hangs over the whole Me Too moment like some kind of toxic waste that you keep finding where you don't expect to find it. He's the quintessential example of the problem, right? I mean, you're talking about male entitlement and bad behavior. He checks all those boxes. Whatever you want to say about Donald Trump in that area, Bill Clinton can ride alongside him all the way. And some of the leading feminists of the time proved, I don't think think hypocrites is too strong a word to describe how they took his side against his legitimate accusers. And to some degree, this continues to this day, although I think opinions are probably changing quickly. It does continue to this day in the sense that, I mean, I know Monica. I don't know her well, but we've met a few times, and I noticed in the news probably not more than a year ago that she got disinvited at a conference that she had been asked to speak at, because then they later secured Bill Clinton. They didn't want to put Bill in a awkward situation.
That was within the past 6 months, I think.
Yeah, right. So,
But that's different from leading feminists supporting Bill Clinton, which is part of what was happening in the 90s that you're pointing to. Let's say that, I think it was a magazine. There are very different scales of the kind of thing you're talking about, right?
let me just add one more piece here, Rebecca. The response to him was certainly problematic from a feminist point of view, and most consequentially, in the 2016 election, because of how Hillary had played that political moment when she was First Lady and defending her Lothario husband from, all of his legitimate accusers. I mean, she had, I don't think this is debatable. I mean, she had bullied these women. She had lied about, or certainly seemed to have lied about things she must have known were true. And in large measure, I think her failure to become president was probably overdetermined, but this has got to be one of the reasons why she's not president, because, at that moment in that debate with Trump, where she was there on the stage going up against one of the most unethical people on earth, and she couldn't make a peep about it because of how badly her husband had behaved and how badly she had behaved in defending him. To some degree, we have to perform an exorcism on the Clintons to get to a reset with respect to the current moment politically.
Sure. I think that we have to perform an exorcism on a lot of, we have to perform an exorcism on the way patriarchal power has left, again, systemically, women dependent on men in all kinds of ways. So not just as husbands, but as leaders of political parties, as part of what happened. I very much agree with a portion of the story you just told, right? So the way that I have long understood what happened during Bill Clinton's administration with regard to the, and for me, the big way in which it was deeply problematic from a feminist point of view is that Bill Clinton gets elected the year after Anita Hill's testimony. And Anita Hill's testimony against Clarence Thomas is such an important point in feminist history. It is coming on the heels of the 1986 Supreme Court decision that finds sexual harassment in the workplace to be a form of sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. This is after more than a decade in the courts, starting in the mid-'70s, where women of color filed some of the first suits, Michelle Vinson, Carmita Wood, about sexual harassment they'd sustained in the workplace. They're borrowing from civil rights laws and discrimination law that's just been made in the wake of the civil rights movement, applying it to their own harassment within their workplaces. Those cases work their way up through the court. In 1986, you have the Supreme Court decision. And then 5 years later, Anita Hill testifies. And the power of Anita Hill's testimony on our view of gendered and racial power in this country was enormous. And we know one version of it, which is that the next year, after a view of the whiteness and the maleness of the Senate Judiciary Committee, then on both sides of the aisle, right? Democrats and Republicans who just had white men listening to and treating this woman of color with disrespect, scorn, disbelief. That view of our representative and governing body, was part of what enraged a generation of women, what propelled a lot of them to seek elected office the next year. We got the Year of the Woman. In retrospect, it seems very small, but in fact it was 4 women elected to the Senate, including the first African-American woman ever elected to the Senate in the history of the country, Carol Moseley Brown. You can draw direct lines. Carol Moseley Brown held a seat that later Barack Obama held. He later became our first black president. It was the year that Dianne Feinstein was elected. She, of course, was the ranking Democrat during the Kavanaugh hearings on a Senate Judiciary Committee. Barbara Boxer was elected. Kamala Harris now holds Barbara Boxer's seat. Kamala Harris was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Patty Murray who has talked sort of most vocally about how anger at the Hill hearings in part motivated her run for the Senate. You know, this was a change with long-lasting effect. I would also say that it was the cusp of sort of hammering home what sexual harassment meant, what it was, what it entailed, how it was a form of discrimination, which had been decided by the Supreme Court but hadn't really been made clear. It was a form of power abuse, of gendered and sexual power abuse. And that conversation was really crucial. And then the next year, we elected a president who was the first Democratic president in 12 years, and on whom all kinds of people on the left, on the Democratic side, however you want to describe the politics at the time, were dependent. It had been 12 years of Reagan and Bush. And here was the guy who was our first Democratic president. And his behavior was in line with old expectations and mores about how men behaved with regard to women, right? This is part of, look, Ted Kennedy during the Anita Hill hearings was also silenced in part because of his history.
Yeah, or did his nephew, wasn't his nephew being prosecuted for rape?
His nephew was on trial, I believe, at the exact same time as the Hill hearings for rape. And Ted Kennedy himself, of course, had left a woman to die in Chappaquiddick and had a terrible reputation for womanizing. So many of our leaders, left and right, I mean, this was part of the association of male sexual power and power abuse with public and political power is really deep and long-lasting. Bill Clinton happened to become president at a time exactly post-Anita Hill hearings when our expectations and the rules were changing, and that was being hammered home to us. That was, I mean, this is a man, you know, who, had he served as president 20 years earlier, probably wouldn't have been called out for any of this behavior because it was presumed to be part of how power worked and how patriarchal power worked. As it was, he was called out. And many of the people who, including some prominent feminists, now some feminists, I want to point out, Andrea Dworkin was incredibly critical of Bill Clinton, right? There were feminists who were furious and who were very clear that Bill Clinton had abused power in his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And there were feminists who believed the other women who told stories about him. But many mainstream feminists did defend him. And part of how we get there is looking at the realities of dependency. When you have white men who have disproportionate shares of power, including political power, so that they are disproportionately the leaders of your party on whom you are dependent, right? To appoint Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Supreme Court, to pass FMLA, our deeply meager, but all there is, protection for people who take, maternity leaves and family health leaves. Those women defended the president. Now, do I think that was an error? Yeah, I do. I think, among other things, it derailed the crucial feminist conversation that was unfolding in that period. And it did, the words you just used, right? Hypocrisy. That this was because feminists were on the line. Now, make no mistake, look at the women who recently called for a year ago, called for the resignation of Al Franken. Had they not, they would have spent the rest of their careers in the Senate being accused of hypocrisy, because while they were working on committees that wanted to address sexual harassment, in the military, on college campuses, everyone would have said to them, but you defended your colleague, so this must just be a partisan issue. As it was, they called for his resignation, and now they, especially Kirsten Gillibrand, who was the first to call for it, is vilified as opportunistic. And by the way, that a very similar thing likely would have happened had feminists had the power. Now there weren't enough women in the Senate at that point to, or in a position to have, exactly called for the president to resign in a way that would have prompted him to, But had they probably would have been accused of being divisive and problematic and bringing down this president who was our first Democratic president in 12 years. And one of my anxieties that gets us to the question of how Hillary Clinton's political career wound up getting viewed through the lens of her husband's bad behavior is that one of the side effects of sexual harassment, assault, power abuse perpetrated by powerful men is that some of the damage done is not done only to the people who are themselves harassed or assaulted or groped, It's done to all kinds of people in the orbit of the harasser. And one of the many ways in which that happens is that so often the women around the harasser, whether or not they themselves were harassed, are evaluated on how they reacted to his behavior. They are asked to be the police, the judge, the jury, and if they do it right or wrong. I mean, Hillary Clinton, for years, when she first ran for president in 2008, I heard from feminists all the time who wouldn't support her because she hadn't left him, right? Her choice to support him hurt her with feminists. At the same time that feminists who defended him were criticized and themselves called hypocrites for having defended him. You know, this is and yet, whatever it is, 20 years later, again, when Kirsten Gillibrand is asked in a conversation like this to go, but in the New York Times, to go back and say, what would you have done about Bill Clinton? And she says, I think he should have resigned after having been pressed several times on this. She is condemned as a traitor and an opportunist, just, swinging on the trend of Me Too, by many powerful Democrats. So, I want to stress that this is one of the things that's becoming more visible, and one of the things that I write about at length in my book is the way that these behaviors, power abuses, aren't just damaging to those who are directly abused. It's that there's a whole cycle of harm that moves outward, waves of harm that move outward and often especially damage the women who, in one way or another, are dependent on this power that is so disproportionately held by these powerful white men. And that's a lot of what the whole process that you just described regarding Hillary Clinton.
You brought up sexual harassment as a specific band of this problem, and I think we should define it, or at least distinguish it from just general sexual misbehavior, which is also being responded to by Me Too. How do you think about sexual harassment? And in particular, I'm trying to steer you toward a distinction you made in opposition to something Masha Gessen wrote. You talk about a category error, so just give us your take on sexual harassment.
Well, sexual harassment, in the decision written by William Rehnquist in 1986, sexual harassment, in fact, was found to be a case of sex discrimination within the workplace. And so it is distinct, though it can be combined with sexual assault. Sexual harassment in the workplace may take the form of sexual assault but sexual harassment doesn't have to be assault in order for it to be behavior that damages women's professional and economic standing, or an abuse of power by a figure who has more power than the person he is groping or coming onto or treating in a diminishing way.
Yeah, so I remember in response to, Me Too kicking off, I remember Masha Gessen wrote in the New Yorker that she was worried about what she called a sex panic, and this idea that we were witnessing a kind of moral panic and a reversion to Victorian ideas about women being inherently vulnerable things that lack agency, and it's all about what the men do to them and around them, and the women are not even participants in their fate on any level. And the point you made in your book, and I think you probably made this in an article before you published your book, but
I did. I wrote in response to Masha Gessen, whose point, by the way, I want to say, I think her point is a very good one. I just didn't think it applied to the conversation that was unfolding in the fall of 2017, which I thought was about behavior that was far broader than simply about sexual harm. Some of it was about sexual harm and assault and violence, but a lot of it was about the acknowledgement of other kind of inequities, some of which had been made clear via instances of a sexualized power abuse, but were not necessarily about the harm sustained by that power abuse. Not sexual harm, professional harm, economic harm.
Right. I recall that you did write about it before, because I had her on the podcast a few months ago and I brought this up with her, and she completely took your point on this point. When you think about sexual harassment in the workplace, it can be harassment that doesn't entail groping or anything overtly a matter of a sexual assault or that kind of transgression. It can just be the fact that a woman is paying this massive price in bandwidth, trying to navigate around the bad behavior, the crude jokes, the...
Right, and that, I mean, exactly. And in fact, to use the sort of least violent instance I can think of, right? Like, let's take the idea of a crude joke. And I just want to sort of lay this out to be clear about what I'm talking about. And I think this is, what you're aiming to describe. If you work in a company and there's a meeting and the boss tells a crude joke, a sexist joke, and you're a woman who is offended by that joke, it's not sexual violence, right? I suppose, and I want to, I'm sure that there are some people who might be triggered by that or experience, a PTSD. But for the vast majority of people, it's not that you've been grabbed or assaulted or done physical harm. However, the way you react to that joke can be determinative of your trajectory within that workplace and thus your professional economic future in ways that sort of extend long beyond that, single instance of a joke. If you laugh along, even if you're uncomfortable and you kind of force yourself to laugh, well, then maybe it invites further crude jokes because you're assumed to be somebody who plays along and is game, and so then you're subjected to a future in which you're regularly told offensive jokes. Maybe if you don't laugh, the boss sees that you don't laugh and begins to associate you with a kind of humorlessness or that you're a problematic person. Maybe you're not invited to the next meeting. And then you're not invited to the next meeting, you gain a reputation, as being disruptive or unpleasant, right? Those are instances, and that can determine, your fate within a company, your relationship between you and your bosses and your colleagues. If you become the problematic person who didn't laugh at that joke, then is there a toll on the people you hang out with in that office because they're hanging out with you and you're the problematic lady who didn't laugh at that dirty joke? Those kinds of things, those are sort of daily landmines for so many women in so many spaces in the world. And that's part of what was being described, what has been described and sort of reviewed and thought about, and the way in which those seemingly tiny choices can have shaped our notions of ourselves, the way that we're valued within our professional spheres, the experiences we had in our careers. And that's part of the discussion that was happening around the hashtag #MeToo movement. It is distinct from Tarana Burke's movement, which was specifically to address the tolls and ubiquity of sexual violence and assault.
Right.
But it was a part of the conversation that sort of exploded last fall.
Okay, so I want to touch the variable of race here. You bring up race a lot in the book, and in ways that strike me as distracting, because one of the most salient examples on the worst end of the spectrum of male misbehavior, certainly in recent memory, is Bill Cosby. And you mentioned Bill Cosby, and you even mentioned him in contexts where you have been talking about white male privilege and white guys thinking they can get away with anything, and then you drop Bill Cosby in. So it seems to me that the temptation to talk about this as often as you do in terms of white men, it just strikes me as frankly awkward, because when you're talking about the litany of abuses of famous people of late, race is not part of the problem, or at least it need not be seen as part of the problem.
Well, I don't think there's ever an instance in which race need not be considered in this country, because what I'm talking about fundamentally is power and who has it. And I am talking about white men, but there are also women who've been credibly and persuasively accused of sexual harassment during this past year. There are, yes, of course, men of color, R. Kelly, Bill Cosby, who have been accused. There are men who have been the accusers of other men, right? So you're right to suggest that the broad strokes that I sometimes use don't give the full picture, but I would say that what I'm describing is power, and that there is no way that you can acknowledge who has had economic, political, public power in this country without acknowledging that the vast proportion of that power has been held by white men. It is true that I don't spend a lot of time on Bill Cosby in this book, but I've written pretty extensively about him in the past, including how his race plays into this, and how, in part, his race and his role regarding respectability politics and black communities, and the way in which The Cosby Show itself, which is the thing that made him beloved and famous, was a product that made white people feel good about racial inequity. I mean, I've written about this at length. And also that the accusations against Bill Cosby leveled by white women made many liberals feel very anxious, in part because of the history of false accusations of sexual violence having been leveled by white women in the past against black men, and that all of these complicated factors were in play when it came to the question of how it was that Bill Cosby's alleged aggressions and rape of multiple women had been in the news, known facts, for more than a decade, during which he was still being celebrated within his profession, getting Lifetime Achievement Awards. So I don't think there is any talking about Bill Cosby without talking about the racial dynamics around Cosby's case and Cosby himself, and the kinds of messages he was sending to black communities, the ways that white liberals had received his show and his career as being fundamentally friendly to whiteness. I mean, Bill Cosby is a man who said there's systemic racism isn't a thing. This is, pull your pants up. Those were, and there was a much milder version of that was transmitted through his beloved sitcom. And that affects the way that liberals who would be concerned about multiple allegations of assault receive those allegations if they're leveled against a black man. So, you are right that within the book, I include Cosby without delving into the racial and gendered politics around him at any length at all. But that is something I've done in my other writing in the past. And there is no way, I don't think, to talk about who has had the disproportionate share of professional, public, and sexual power in this country without acknowledging that both gendered and racial identities and power structures are in play. And so that is why I often talk about white men. And there's also no way to talk about what happened during, starting in the fall of 2017 without acknowledging the racial dynamics around the accusers. And the fact that it was prominent, wealthy, white women who were some of the first to level the accusations against Harvey Weinstein. And also, I believe, I'd have to go back and fact check this, but I believe that the only two accounts he bothered to deny were the accounts of the two women of color, Lupita and Salma Hayek.
It seems like power is the variable. I mean, of course, I'm going to grant you that white people have a disproportionate share of power, right? So that
and men have a disproportionate share of power.
Maleness and whiteness correlate with power in our society. There's no question of that. But it seems that differences in power cut through the data fairly accurately. Like Kobe Bryant, what happened to the rape allegation against him? I don't know. I don't even remember what I thought about it. But he's a famous, wealthy, black athlete who's enjoyed a result of his entanglement with the justice system that, as you know, many black men don't. O.J. Simpson is a quintessential example of this. The idea that he is the representative of the fate of black men in our justice system is ridiculous, but he's obviously there were racial dynamics in how that jury decision ended up. I guess it worries me to reflexively put race into the conversation when other variables account for the disparities in outcome we're seeing. If we're talking about power, let's talk about power. Of course, we can notice that men have more of it and white men have the most of it. But the reason why it's so counterproductive from my point of view is you're endlessly opening yourself up for the embarrassing counterexample that you can't figure out how to talk about, whether it's Bill Cosby or Morgan Freeman, or, as I think you were probably referencing, Asia Argento, the woman actress who...
Oh, no, I was actually thinking of but Asia Argento is another example. I was thinking of the NYU professor, Avital.
Oh, okay.
Feminist philosopher.
Oh, yeah, actually, I do know that story. So the moment you have women suddenly doing something, or men of color, or, God forbid, women of color, again, this is not to say that racism isn't also a problem, but it's not encroaching everywhere.
But I don't think that those stories are, embarrassing contradictions. I think they are, as you yourself said, sort of exceptional cases, and that I don't think, again, they become, they only, if you can talk about those cases, I just talked about a lot of the racial dynamics around Cosby. If you can talk about the way that race has shaped, so many of these cases and from so many different directions, to acknowledge race and gender as factors in who has power in this country is not to tell some rudimentary, simple story. It's all complicated. You can't talk about O.J. Simpson and the kind of investments that people had in that case without again looking back at the extremely long and terrible history of black men, and especially those who in some way were rising to power, being accused, in many cases falsely, of sexual misconduct. This is also something that Clarence Thomas himself brought up and cast, this
to his advantage.
The allegations made by Anita Hill against him
Yeah.
as a high-tech lynching, right? It's only embarrassing if you take them as sort of the most rudimentary, that racism is just about how every individual reacts to every other individual, and not looking at who has been granted and who has held the disproportionate amount of power in this country. And there's, yes, Bill Cosby, Kobe Bryant, O.J. Simpson, right? And then you have Roger Ailes, Donald Trump, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bill Clinton. This is the number of white men who have wielded popular, professional, economic, political power in this country. We are talking about massive structural realities, and, individual exceptions to the rule do not make that rule any less true. They're exceptions that we need to talk about, and we need to talk about the power dynamics and the kind of and how race did play into those exceptions. And it's often a very complicated story. But if you're telling that story and are willing to actually have the conversations about how race and gender and power and class intersect, then good. That's part of what we need to do. That's part of the process we have to get through to understand, how our history meets our present, and how, what we're doing to address pervasive and systemic inequality in this country.
I want to come back to the point that Masha Gessen was making about there being a kind of panic here. She called it a sex panic. I called my concern here a concern over a moral panic. And there's a feeling that many of us have gotten that there's a kind of inquisitorial spirit to much of what has happened and what may yet happen under the banner of Me Too. And anger, your much championed anger as the driving force here, I think it can somewhat reliably push us in that direction. I want to bring up another person here who amusingly was the actor who played Kavanaugh in that wonderful SNL send-up of the proceedings, Matt Damon, and what happened to him when he had the brilliant idea of coming forward 15 minutes into the Me Too eruption and venturing his opinion. But to the eyes of most people, I think, what he said was about as anodyne as utterances get. Basically he was saying, I totally support Me Too. I don't have his quote verbatim, but correct me if I'm wrong. He was basically saying this has been a long time coming. This is all great, but of course we have to distinguish between rape on the one hand and, groping somewhere in the middle, and bad jokes on the far extreme of the benign. And, all of these things are problematic in their own way, but they're problematic in very different ways. And I'm worried that we're losing these distinctions. And for that, he just got savaged, right? And swiftly apologized and said, I'm never going to talk about this again. So what there was a hunger for at that moment, and I think there still is some assurance that we will observe that what Bill Cosby did. I mean, there's probably some daylight between Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein. I mean, Harvey Weinstein is, from what I can tell, an absolute monster. And actually, you have your own interesting story to tell about having met him. But, the guy seems like a total sociopath. But, what he did is not the same as having systematically drugged and raped 50 women, if that's in fact what Cosby did. But, Harvey Weinstein almost certainly also belongs in prison for what he did. But then there's Charlie Rose, right, who's done other egregious things that professionally harmed people, but I'm not sure what should happen to him. And then we've got Al Franken, and then we've got, Aziz Ansari produce a very bad date for somebody. And there's this spectrum that I think Matt Damon and many others were worried at the time was getting ignored or getting summarized in the same sentence as this is what men are up to. Can you respond to that concern and why you?
There's a lot that you just said that I'd like to respond to.
Yes, go.
First of
Have
all,
at it.
I wrote at the time, and many other people who were writing about this, many feminists and journalists were writing about this and affirming that women know perfectly well that there is a difference between violent rape and groping, physical coercion, bad sex, off-color jokes. Again, where I disagreed with Masha Gessen, who I think is brilliant and whose point about the perils of a reversion to kind of Victorian attitudes about women as passive sexual victims, that point is a really valid one. I did not think that it applied to the conversation as it was actually unfolding in the fall of 2017 or since. And to that end, I would point out that nobody's suggesting that Charlie Rose go to jail. Charlie Rose was alleged to have, physically and conversationally harassed, come onto, and in some cases, physically groped and approached young women who worked for him. He was accused by more than 35 women, I believe, of doing this, interns, and calling them and telling them when he was their boss about his wet dreams about them. This is behavior that, if it's indeed true, probably means Charlie Rose shouldn't have a job. And that is, in fact, what's happened to Charlie Rose. Nobody has taken his fortune from him or deprived him of his liberty or criminally convicted him. He was fired. What happened to Matt Damon is people were mean to him on the internet. And they were mean in part because this thing that he was saying, which is the point you just made, I think people were angry in response to that, in part because it was a sort of condescending misreading of the actual very nuanced and complicated conversation that was taking place, and a form of collapsing all the varied and nuanced reactions to the different kinds of stories that were being told in a way that made the various people who were telling stories appear punitive, or to use your word, inquisitorial, when in fact what a lot of these people were doing, and this is really important, with just telling stories about what happened to them. They weren't making the decisions about the consequences. This was not an inquisition. This was not women or the men lobbing allegations as judge and jury. The role of the women telling their stories of harassment or assault or any of the, wide variation of tales of what it had been like as, to navigate these sexual power inequities, were simply the act they were engaging in was telling their stories. And then in many cases, institutions that, by the way, were probably covering their own asses for having, covered up or supported a lot of these guys, turned a blind eye or, not cared about, what were known aggressions, covered their own asses by firing them. It wasn't the women who were making the decisions about, the consequences for these men, and yet they were depicted as, part of a witch hunt, as if they were the magistrates, throwing men in jail. Men, except for Bill Cosby, and that's after 12 years of legal action. So far, no one else has gone to jail. It is an open question. Harvey Weinstein is the one who is, we know, being criminally charged. Otherwise, we are not talking about criminal charges for any of these guys. Now, as you said, what happened to Matt Damon? And I write in my book about how Terry Gilliam, about all the ways in which the consequences that these men did face, losing their jobs, being criticized, having people be mean to them on the internet, all of it, talk about flattening it. So many of these things were cast by their friends or by themselves as having been violently aggressed upon, right? So Terry Gilliam said of Matt Damon that he was beaten to death. Now, as you pointed out, Matt Damon appeared on Saturday Night Live in a widely praised skit, 3 weeks ago? Matt Damon's career is not over.
No, it's
Bill
not.
O'Reilly, who was fired from Fox News, has the #1 best-selling book in America right now. The ways in which the flattening was in, I think, the assumption of many people who were asking some of the questions that you were, the flattening of what was happening to these guys being cast as death. There are a million examples of this. Mike Barnacle saying of Mark Halperin, who lost his job as a Morning Joe and MSNBC commentator after multiple women accused him of having pressed his penis against them when they were young and working for him at a network. And his friend Mike Barnacle said, sure, he should pay for what he did, but how many times can you kill a guy? Tom Brokaw, who was, a woman told a highly corroborated, well-documented story of how he tried to kiss her in the 90s. No one was coming for Tom Brokaw's job. He is an elder statesman in the media. There was no, torch gang saying down with Tom Brokaw. It was a minor story in a larger piece about a culture at that news network. And Tom Brokaw wrote a letter about himself claiming that he'd been taken to the guillotine and stripped of his honor. The flattening or exaggeration that you see coming from women who were simply telling the stories of having been kissed or having been groped. The flattening, I think, and compression of categories came when we treated these guys as if they'd all been trotted off to jail or murdered or guillotined in a revolution. And the fact is, some of them lost their jobs. Some of them are back. Some of them, are doing just fine. None of them, maybe Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby is the exception to this, so far have been brought up on criminal charges. Many of them, a couple of them have been offered prominent places in which to tell their side of the story. Many of them have been cast as the victims. Many of them still are deeply loved by millions of people. That is true of Charlie Rose. At some point in the past year, he sent a butt tweet or something like the letter H, and all kinds of people responded to him on Twitter, we love you, we miss you so much. They were not killed. They're not dead, they're not incarcerated. They were not found guilty. And in fact, the women who are so often accused of being, the killers, who beat Matt Damon to death, what those women were doing were raising their voices and telling stories of what their careers had been like or what their experience of sexual coercion or harassment had been like. They were just telling full stories of their lives, and they were quickly cast as executioners. And that is part of the way that power works. You mentioned the story that I had about Harvey Weinstein. When I was a 25-year-old reporter, I won't tell the whole thing, but basically I was sent down, I was writing a story about a movie that his company was producing and holding back, and I had reported the story. He wouldn't return my calls. I went to a book party with a colleague who was the gossip columnist. I asked him a question on the record. He answered it with a totally banal answer. I turned away to go. I got my on-the-record response, and then he got angry and told me it was off the record and tried to grab my tape recorder, and he pushed me with his finger. He called me, I don't know what the language limitations are, but are there language limitations?
No, not at all.
Okay. He called me a cunt. This is in a big book party, at the Tribeca Grand, the night before the 2000 election. He called me a cunt. He said, I'm glad I'm the fucking sheriff of this fucking piece of shit fucking town. He pushed me hard on the shoulder with his forefinger. My colleague stepped in, calmed him down, and then it exploded again. He pushed my colleague down a step, and, my colleague's tape recorder hit a woman's head, knocked her out. He then took my colleague out onto the street on 6th Avenue in Manhattan, put him in a headlock. The next day, the way that party was, covered with journalists and photographers. And the next day, the way it was spun, I can't remember if it was New York Times News, was that we were pushy reporters at this party, so that we were cast as the ones who were the aggressors. We were the pushy ones, even though this gargantuanly powerful and actually physically incredibly imposing man had put had physically pushed two young women, my colleague was a man, two young reporters. Those reporters were cast as the ones who'd been the disruptive force. And this is, I also write about in the book about how I noticed this pattern with regard to Freddie Gray's death in Baltimore in 2015. Freddie Gray is a man who was taken into a police van and given a rough ride and later died of his injuries. And in response to his death, there were protests. He was African American, there were protests. And when I was a reporter at the time, writing about all kinds of forms of inequality, and the thing that I noticed was that all the news reports said that the violence started when protesters threw rocks, and that the violence done by the more powerful entity to the less powerful entity was kind of indiscernible as violence because that was just how power worked. But when the people who had less power threw stones at police cars, which was fundamentally a lesser kind of power, they were cast as the instigators of violence, as the disruptive force. That's the mob of, women who have no power in the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, who's actually being confirmed to a position where he's going to have power over their bodies, their votes, their ability to collectively bargain for the rest of their lives. Their only option is to raise their voices and yell during the vote for his confirmation. They are cast as a mob by our president, by the party that supports our president. They're the aggressive mob. And that is what happened around me too, is that the women who were using the only power available to them, because they weren't the anchors or the chefs or the editors or the movie producers. Part of the story that they were telling was about the circumstances that ensured that they weren't those powerful figures. The way that they felt exiled or were self-exiled from the professions in which they had worked and been ambitious, and yet they had been harassed or assaulted and had wound up leaving or never rising within those professions. The power they had available to them was to raise their voices and tell their stories. And how were they cast? As witch hunt, as part of a witch hunt, mob justice, inquisitors, executioners. And I think that that's really worth thinking about. It is a pattern that is around us every day. Now that I see it, it's everywhere. When power works aggressively, when a more powerful person assaults a less powerful person, it is almost indiscernible to us. But when that less powerful person resists, either by telling the story or throwing a rock or whatever it may be, and disrupts or dissents from the way that power is supposed to work, that is quickly cast as aggressively disruptive, chaotic, problematic, violent. And that pattern was and that's when we talk about what happened to Matt Damon. Matt Damon said a thing that a lot of people were angry at, and they got angry at him on Twitter. And now he's on Saturday Night Live and and he's fine.
Well, so there was a lot in there. I want to respond. I think if nothing else, we will prove how complicated this topic is. But by way of taking Matt Damon's foot out of my mouth, I should say a few things. First, there's no question that some people should be going to jail and some people should lose their careers, and then there should be consequences to many of these actions we've been discussing. And I think that the Matt Damon moment exemplifies another concern, however. What we were witnessing there, at least to my eye, was the limits of Matt Damon's power, right? I mean, Matt Damon is one of the most powerful people in our society. As you say, he should be able to recover from almost anything. He has very few bosses, and yet he perceived a risk to his career in hanging out there for more than 5 seconds under this blowback on Twitter. And it's very interesting. It's like the story you told about Harvey Weinstein. That particular part of the story had nothing to do with sexual dynamics or sexual harassment. That was just raw power exerted by a sociopath. He manhandled you guys, got you out of his party, managed to get the press to cover it up. But he's kind of a unique case. I mean, he was managing to get all kinds of things covered up that ordinary powerful people can't. But Bill Clinton was president of the United States, and he still couldn't prevent a semen-stained dress from showing up on the evening news in about 24 hours. Harvey Weinstein, faced down Brad Pitt, who was complaining that he had mistreated his girlfriend, Gwyneth Paltrow at the time, and Brad Pitt, another extremely successful, powerful person, apparently couldn't do a damn thing or wouldn't do a damn thing in the face of Harvey Weinstein's power. I still can't figure out why Harvey Weinstein had any power making those niche movies. You know, I mean, like
There were movies that won Oscars and
Yeah,
made. I mean,
but still,
within the
I mean-
industry had tremendous power over who was considered
Granted,
who
it's
could win
sti-
Oscars.
It still is not. I mean, Shakespeare in Love is not a billion-dollar franchise, and we're living in an environment
But
where
Gwyneth Paltrow won an Oscar for Shakespeare
Gra-
in Love. And
granted,
if you think that winning an Oscar isn't sort of the ultimate,
it's something. Yeah, it's something.
you know,
but-
power achievement for people who work in Hollywood and are ambitious within that field, then I mean, I don't know how we talk about power.
No, but I'm just saying the tide has turned so quickly and in so many surprising ways. I mean, we have, who is it? His name's James Gunn, the writer he is the writer of a billion-dollar franchise, the Guardians of the Galaxy, who got immediately fired and had his movie torpedoed for a history of bad tweets. I think it's right to think that a lot of these powerful people are reasonably worried that they don't have the power they think they have. They can't take the risks. Frankly, the reason why I can have this conversation with you is there's no one who can fire me. I can explore this with you and make mistakes. And part of what is novel about this conversation is showing whatever mistakes I make to the audience and just processing it in real time with you. And that's the experiment I'm happy to run here. But I couldn't do it on CNN with you. And there's something that worries people about that. And it's not just guys with power who are worried. I mean, there are many women journalists whose names you know, who you write about in your book. People like Caitlin Flanagan and Katie Royfe, and I don't think you mentioned Claire Berlinski in your book, but I mean, Claire Berlinski. They've taken this other point in defense of the Matt Damons of the world because they see a kind of frenzy or witch hunt or moral panic or at least imprecision here in how we target people. And there's even a point in your book where you acknowledge this, where you say, and now I'm going to quote you, quote, "The rage that some of us were feeling didn't necessarily correspond to the severity of the trespass. Lots of us were as incensed about the guy who looked down our shirt at a company retreat as we were about Weinstein, even if we could acknowledge that there was something fundamentally nuts about that." So, yes,
Do
you're
you want to go on and say what I write after that?
Well, I
Because
think
I explain why. I mean, you're absolutely right. This is what I mean, by the way, when I say that those of us, I was writing that sentence, appeared in a piece that I wrote in real time in the fall of 2017. And that's what I mean when I say that some of the flattening that's been done is behaving as if we were just out there wielding these clubs in which we were not, acknowledging distinction. I write about that and make that point precisely because I go on to make the point that what I was getting to and what I would write in a later piece, I believe, in response to Masha Gessen's piece, but I was working through it there. I say, we know that there's something fundamentally irrational about the way that these giant trespasses are making us as angry as some of the minor stuff. But what I go on to say is, in part, that's because it's not just about the sexual violence. It's about getting this view of our value, our diminished value in the world. It's about sexism. I think the end of that paragraph is like, that's because what we were identifying was not simply a pattern of sexual harm, but rather sexism, systemic subjugation, systemic gender inequity. And that's why, and that's part of the argument that I go on to make. But just to be clear, that was a sentence that I wrote in the same period that people were saying that people like me were just making these broad characterizations in which everything was the same.
you acknowledge that it was fundamentally nuts, right? So, or that there was something fundamentally nuts about that.
Something fundamentally nuts. And then I go on to write about why we got there. And I want to go back to what you said about Matt Damon risking something, or you risking something and talking to me. What are you risking that I'm gonna argue back? That I'm gonna say I think you're wrong, or that I'm gonna say
no.
Actually,
No,
I think
it's
that's
not.
sexist or racist.
It's the
what
audience.
What was Matt Damon risking? He was risking that people would disagree with him. What is Katie Royfe risking? That people, and as I did, disagreed with her vociferously. That is very different from how it's often cast, which is, as the victims of this mob. Katie Royfe got, I believe it was a cover story in Harper.